Salam, Sanvanani, Molweni, Namaste, Vanakkam, Hetepu, and welcome to this Sunday's edition of The People's Voice, produced and presented by your host, Shabnam Pelesa Mohammed for Salaamedia, your humanitarian journalism platform and portal. We're broadcasting live from eThekwini, KZN, in Durban specifically. Welcome to the show. It is Sunday, the 13th of September, and so much is happening in South Africa that we need to unpack. But tonight, we're in conversation with Karima Brown, Nkosikhona Duma, and Qaanitah Hunter, journalists, to unpack and ventilate the relationship between politicians and journalists, and journalism and politics. Friends, enemies, or eagle-eyed watchers, what does civil society expect, demand, and deserve? Let's help you tune into a robust and critical conversation tonight, so you can comment, ask our guests questions, and share your ideas. Here's how we do it. To watch the show, you can watch from the Salaamedia Facebook page. It's a live video. You can also watch via Salaamedia's YouTube or Salaamedia's Twitter account. You can listen live via the Salaamedia website, the Salaamedia or TuneIn app, and all free-to-air decoders. Before I properly introduce our brilliant guests, I'm going to start a watch party, and you can do the same. Go to the Salaamedia page that's on Facebook, and you look for today's video and you just start a watch party. It's as simple as that, so that more people can join the conversation from your personal profile as well as your groups. All right. And our watch party is about to begin. To introduce our brilliant guests once more, and we'll be bringing them onto camera in our virtual stage. We are talking again about the relationship between journalists and politicians. Friends, enemies, or eagle-eyed watchers, what does civil society expect? Nkosikhona Duma is a KZN correspondent for EyeWitness News. Karima Brown is a political analyst and a journalist, also the host of The Fix, which broadcasts on eNCA. And Qaanitah Hunter is the political editor for News 24. Journalists, welcome to The People's Voice.
Thank you so much for having us.
An absolute pleasure. Looking forward to a robust conversation with you. Now, we've just commemorated 43 years since the passing of activist, servant leader, and revolutionary Steve Biko. A lot of people think South Africa would be a very different place had he not been assassinated. So let's start off the show on a fitting note to ask you this question. How is Steve Biko's philosophy of I write what I like, and the most powerful weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed? How is that relevant for journalism? Let's start with you, Karima.
I think the most important thing, Shabnam, is the question of agency that the legacy of Black consciousness leaves all people of South Africa, but in particular Black people. I think that the self-reliance of the BC era in our politics is something that is sadly missed, particularly decades into democracy, where there is almost an expectation that the state must deliver, and citizens wait passively for that delivery. The Black consciousness movement for me was about self-reliance, was about freeing yourself mentally, being free in your own mind, in your own body, using your agency to bring about change, and doing it in such a way that you ground yourself as a Black person, that you articulate yourself as a Black person, but most importantly, that you take your future into your own hands. And so for me, the legacy of Steve Biko is the reliance on our own agency, the issue of putting communities first. And the most important thing is that we can rise to any occasion. We don't need an imperialist or colonial standard to which to hold ourselves. So for me, that is the thrust of the Black consciousness movement and its legacy. And I think it's now more needed than ever. If you look at COVID-19, many communities have had to rely on themselves, on community organizations, NGOs, and others. So I think for me, those are some of the rich legacies that we need to actually pick up and build on from that time.
Off to a brilliant start there with Karima Brown. And Nkosikhona Duma, let me pass the mic over to you. How is Steve Biko relevant to journalism?
Well, I think he is very much relevant to us today, because we are seeing this entrance of many journalists who are young and Black in a world, in an industry that is still held by powers that be, the powers of the past. I mean, media in South Africa is a monopoly that is not doubted by any standard. And you go into this field, and I speak for myself here as a young journalist, you get into this industry that is, if you look at the top, the powers that decide to be are not Black African in the sense of how I look, you know, and there is always this sense of conflict as to how you apply yourself, the stories as you do. You get into a point sometimes where you pitch stories to an editor and you feel as if you have a role to educate them on why the story matters because as disappointing as it may sound, non-Black African people, in my experience, have not taken the necessary steps to learn about us in a world where in a country where we are the majority. And so you not only have to educate the newsroom about why the story matters, you have to educate the people who make news, right? Which is something that I feel I don't have to do. And I think the ideology then of Steve Biko is still necessary. I think we need more communities to make it as clear as possible, especially now where we are existing in a media world where journalists are also held to account. The media in itself has to constantly defend its position, its relevance in society, and just in the same way as politicians have to do it. And I think that is very much Steve Biko's ideals of self-reliance, as Karima has just stated, ideas of taking control of your future are still very much relevant in making sure that our newsrooms really take Black issues as serious as they should, because I don't think we are at that stage yet.
Some insightful lived experience there from Nkosikhona Duma. Qaanitah Hunter, how is Steve Biko relevant for your work as a journalist?
I think, the Black consciousness movement and what it stood for, obviously, as Karima said, lives on in the sense of the self-reliance. I reflect on the words of Dikgang Moseneke, who was a Pan-Africanist himself, and someone who's walked in the footsteps of someone like Steve Biko, who said, talks about being my own liberator and perpetuating that kind of narrative of people taking that agency for themselves and for their future. And I think that level of that conversation is something that's still very, very prevalent today. More importantly, I mean, we celebrate the death, or we mark the death, or celebrate the life of Steve Biko this week, while we have, the Clicks protest, for example, around here. And so there is these so many years later, these unresolved issues around race and around African people and them being in a majority, and how is it that white people relate to that, and racism just more generally that persists in the country. So for me, it's definitely an eye-opener, a reminder, something to jolt our beings, to not just be passive in all of this, and to sort of be inspired by that generation and by the ideology in that we are in fact our own liberators.
Some interesting perspective there from Qaanitah Hunter. Obviously, 26 years into our democracy and journalism, intersectionality plays such an important role in being a lens through which we do everything. So what we want to do next is watch an edited clip from an interview that I did with Thembisa Fakude, who's of course a researcher with the Al Jazeera Center for Studies, in which he unpacks issues with journalism under lockdown and in general. My question to you will be, after that clip, what do you agree with and what must change how? So let's have a look at that clip and that interview with Thembisa. My My third question, the relative freedom which we enjoy depends on public opinion, right? I didn't say it, George Orwell said it. I'm sure you know him quite well. Mass media influences how facts are viewed and how facts are debated, and this then crafts public opinion, which although is extremely powerful, corrupt governments actually don't care what public opinion is. So let's ask this question. How much influence does government have on the media in South Africa and globally?
Well, it's worrying because we have governments now who are actually funding and sponsoring media institutions, and that is quite troubling. We see the effects on that now during the COVID-19, where institutions such as SABC in South Africa has had no choice but to sing from the hymn book or from the script that is provided to it by the government. And
right.
Those who go against that script are temporarily suspended, as it was the case in point with my former colleague Jane Dutton and Colin Gambi from eNCA. They happened to pursue a certain line which was contrary to the prevailing nationalism in South Africa, which is extremely dangerous, by the way, at this time.
Yes, it is.
And it has always been trying all the time. You know, yes, we do get press releases and press statements from governments, but we never believe them. We always go and report on those people that are affected by situations. Imagine if all of us had to listen to what Bashar al-Assad and people like, all these despots and Yoweri Museveni of Uganda were telling us, and we report verbatim on what they are saying to us. Then you'll be killing
right.
journalists. And what we see now during this coronavirus is that journalists are actually reading from the script, and I don't blame them. You know, the people who are currently controlling the dissemination or disseminating information is government. And the media has become a bit lazy, I'll argue, to go out and look for alternative facts. So we are all repeating what the ministries of health are telling us, or what the president or heads of state are telling us. And that is extremely dangerous. I think it's the beginning of something that might lead to the destruction of our fraternity as journalists. We need to, notwithstanding that we are bombarded with this information, which to an extent is accurate, but we have to go and get our own information from our own sources.
Well, Thembisa, you're one of the very few journalists who's actually said what you've said right now. And I think it's a very important statement because journalists are afraid to dissent and be seen as unpatriotic, to be kicked out of press conferences, and exactly what we've seen happen at eNCA and the situation at the SABC. So
one of the downsides of lockdown journalism is that we are spoon-fed now by the government. Government dictates the narrative, and that's extremely dangerous. Because none of us know exactly what's going on. We all wait for Zulum Kiza to tell us how many people died and how many new infections are there, and we've got nothing to compare to. And right. that for me is extremely dangerous. Secondly, is this the prevailing feeling of national cohesion and patriotism. So we see the rise, particularly in South Africa, the rise of patriotism generally, or patriotic journalism, for lack of a better term. That is extremely. Right. So what we see now, we see that trapping, and unfortunately, many of our journalists at home finding it very difficult to be objective. They are mimicking and reporting verbatim what the press statements from governments is saying, and that's not, for me, that's not journalism. Journalism Correct. Is always getting the other side of the story, and we're not getting the other side of the story. We fell into the trap. All of us are consuming and reporting or repeating what's been fed to us by the state and governments, and that's not my journalism. Journalism has always been, you go out there and get your own independent sources, and from those sources, you make up your mind on what's the truth and what's the truth and what's false. But what we see happening now is that everything is ready-made. We have we used to call them the rooftop journalism, where you just go to a press conference, you get the statement, and you climb up and make your piece to camera and have your signature without even going to the streets, getting to understand what are people feeling, etc. And I think the danger this time is that most journalists are falling into the trap of reading from the script, and our audiences are getting used to that. And those who begin to read or not to read from the script are then somehow criticized and are labeled as unpatriotic and as not good journalists and pessimistic, etc. What's happening now with this trend of feeding the same staple to our audiences, which is not inquisitive, which is not questioning power, etc. There will come a time when we start telling the truth, people will revolt against us, and that's the trapping of journalism, and we need to be very, very careful.
Let's bring our guests back into the studio. That was Thembisa Fakude with some very insightful and robust analysis and critique for journalism under lockdown and journalism in general. There will come a time, he says, where we start to tell the truth, or when we tell the truth and the people will revolt against us, they just won't believe us. What are your thoughts on this critique and analysis from Thembisa? Let's start with Karima.
I think Thembisa's statements should probably be viewed against probably the first week or two of the lockdown, where South Africans were getting their heads around what a national state of disaster meant, what the powers of the National Command Council is, and also just the fact that government needed to update the country almost on a daily basis, not just about the regulations, because it was literally affecting people's lives, as in where you could walk, where you could shop, whether you could go to work or not. So we were learning as we were doing. But I think that our analysis is slightly outdated. If you look at the robust work that has been done by journalists around uncovering the PPE scandal, for example, the way in which police brutality happened, assisted in some instances by the SNDF, by journalists, the kind of probing interviews that people have been having, and also the insistence that the president takes questions after his addresses, the analysis doesn't hold true in its entirety. So I think that for me, South African journalists have from the onset reminded all politicians and the government, because it's not just the government that needs to be held accountable, or in relation to which journalists need to be held accountable. There's also political parties. Very recently, the EFF, for example, had a press conference where it didn't allow certain journalists in, but the rest of the media went, and they spoke about whether they are corrupt or not. But the very people who actually wrote stories about tracking that corruption, they've been banned from attending their gatherings. Just recently we saw the manhandling, and as in literally manhandling, of an eNCA journalist at the Clicks protest by the EFF, for example. So it's not just government in which we have to hold ourselves to account. Increasingly, other political parties do the same. The DA, for example, is also quite prescriptive about who they give interviews to, when they speak live, and how they interface with journalists. Ellen Zille, the DA's federal leader, have often bullied journalists on social media and even in interviews. So I think the analysis for me is dated. There's elements of truth in it, but I think that over the last few months of the lockdown, you've actually seen an incredibly robust media in South Africa. The other thing is also that the media in South Africa isn't actually homogenous. It's really important to make that point. It's not one thing, and it's not just white-owned. Independent isn't white-owned. The Sunday Times group, the Arena group, isn't white-owned. eNCA isn't white-owned. So when we speak about the media, we need to be careful, because A, it's not homogenous. Two, there is a diversification of ownership, but we need to ask ourselves whether that diversification of ownership actually means real inclusion. Because if you ask yourself, where's the voice of working class people, then you can see the holes in how the ownership works. If you ask yourself, why is there so little assistance for community media, then you can actually criticize the MDDA that needs to do more, that was specifically set up to give communities a voice. If you look at the state at which community radio stations have closed, then you can see that some of our media might well be Black owned, but marginalized communities, women, young people are often kept out of the news, have to do dastardly acts or have to be raped and abused to make front pages. So it's not just about whether a news organization is Black owned, it's also about which class interests that media serves. And in South Africa, the predominant class that the media serves, whether it's Black or white owned, is the middle class.
Absolutely agree with you on that. Nkosikhona, I know you've got 20 minutes only with us before your next gig. So I want to ask you, is there any truth in what Tembisa said? Yes, that interview was in May earlier this year, but are there elements of truth in it that remind us of our role as journalists?
Yes, indeed. I mean, and I just want to say, I want to appreciate what Karima has just said. And I agree with her that the stage we're in right now, the stage of lockdown, has actually highlighted the resilience of media colleagues in South Africa who, despite the challenges that they face, despite the challenges, let me include myself, that we face, we still try and do our best to wake up every morning and to do more within the constraints under which we work. And I know that, I mean, all of us in this discussion are appreciative of the kind of space that we have to work in. You have to tweet an event, you have to file in 1 hour, you have to constantly update people. You have to report live as events as are happening. And it's almost as if there is no space for investigative journalism in South Africa, because you have to churn out as much information as we possibly can because of the way media revenue generation functions today. I want to appreciate what Karima said, that despite everything else, the resilience of the media has been shown. But I also want to appreciate another point that she just made, that the media is not homogenous. And I think we've moved on, because sometimes when we talk about how the media ownership functions in South Africa, as being a few people who actually are the big bosses in the media of South Africa, it's almost as if we have to make it clear that we're not just referring to big white old bosses here in South Africa, that 26 years later you see some very powerful Black individuals. And those people are primarily interested in their own class interests. And while you have organizations like the BLF, who want to perpetuate this idea that, you know what, we're still stuck in a white versus Black issue, and that Black people who somehow perpetuate ideas that seem to favor what has historically been associated with white people, and that those Black people are agents of whiteness, rather than actually serving their own personal class interests. And I think that's an important point that we have to talk on. I think what Tembisa spoke about, he said something very important. He said he highlighted everything else that is happening right now, where you see journalists taking a media statement and then churning it out because of the way in which we have to work today, right? What I found is that revenue generation systems in the media industry are in tatters, right? So many people, I've been very fortunate to meet senior journalists, people who've been working in the industry for years, who are passionate about their job, who love it. But the main problem that I found is how do you sustain journalism as an industry, right? We know that with online, much of the money now goes to Google and Facebook. But who's actually challenging that? Are we seeing media companies actually looking at legislation, right? Because you clearly cannot say, Facebook, give us the money, and expect them to use their own moral conscience. What action is being taken by media colleagues, senior people in the media industry, who have to make sure that there is revenue that is generated into this, because we have to make sure that we tweet, right? Because we also are competing now against fake news.
Space. Yeah, and we're competing against fake news I appreciate that
Yes.
that insight from you, Nkosikhona, and I'm going to move to Qaanitah because I want to get through as many questions as I can before you need to leave us, Nkosi. So Qaanitah, let me pass the mic over to you. Self-reflection, is there anything in what Thembisa said that is relevant and a timely reminder to us about our role as journalists?
Yeah, I think with ultimate respect, I think that, the analysis is completely irrelevant to where we are now and what has happened since then. You've seen under the most trying circumstances where literally there's a bloodbath in the media industry, where people are losing their jobs en masse. There is an effort to hold government accountable. Number one, the PPE scandals. Almost everywhere across the country, there's been reportage around corruption in the procurement of personal protective equipment. The only reason why there's an Auditor General report on this matter is because of media reporting. When you talk about laws that have been changed, or regulations rather around some of the controversial regulations adopted by government, it was media reporting that shined a light on those matters. When Collins Khoza passed away, when so many other people died in police custody, it was the media that. So I really don't subscribe to this very lazy and easy analysis to say media in South Africa is repeating what governments say. By law, we are not allowed to use our own numbers of coronavirus. We have to rely on the NICD and the Department of Health to give us these numbers so that we are able to communicate it to the public. Because what metric, and if you look around the world, it's everyone has to rely on the state when it comes to coronavirus. Have we dropped the ball sometimes? Absolutely. But again, the media is not a homogeneous institution. It's not one body. It's not one political party. It's varied in terms of a whole lot of dynamics. And so I think when we want to talk about criticizing or reflecting on the media during this time of lockdown, we should be talking about, the transparency of government, and could we have done better to force the hand of transparency, like Karima said, about the president actually answering questions. And then I can say we have pushed, but we have not pushed hard enough, because we're still seeing this resistance that in 5 months he's only taking questions twice. You see, when you can, when the criticism is, you're just taking government data laying down, I think I can take exception to that, because there are a number of media houses that have filed prior applications to the state. Not only the institution that I work on, but lots and lots of institutions. When you talk about the issue of excessive deaths around coronavirus, the government has said no. There is adequate reporting on coronavirus death. Whereas the question is then pushed forward to them to say, okay, but what happens with the data that there's so many more excessive deaths than usual during this period? And so I think that it's often lazy and not constructive to say, the media, the SABC, gets funding for governments, therefore they are pro-government. I think that, number one, it adds to the distrust of the media, and the only currency, you, Shabnam, all of us here today, the only currency we have as journalists is trust from the public. And if we gamble with that trust by saying, such and such media organization is dictated to by the white bosses, I think what it does is perpetuates a culture of distrust. Whereas you can deal with specific issues. You can deal with the media organization that does not abide by the press code or does not sign up to the Ombud program or institution. You can deal with transformation. That's tangible things. But throwing around distrust, especially at a time where all of our figures, Karima, you can back me on this, that all of our data is showing that the public has become more trusting of the media during this time, because if you see it in the numbers, you see it in the amount of people watching news shows on television. You look at clicking on news websites. Meaning people are hungry for information, and that it doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from trusting the news source. And so, yes, I understand that the concern that we should not sort of squander this trust whereas we get to a point, what Tembisa said, where no one will trust us. But I do think that the counter has been happening, especially in the last 4 months, where people are realizing that when President Cyril Ramaphosa says something and makes grand promises, it is the media that pokes holes in those grand promises. When government says or doesn't want to say anything, it's the media that pokes holes around state-owned enterprises or whatever it may be. And so I think
Can I ask you to just pause there for me, because we're halfway through already, right? Nkosikhona says you can stay with us till 5 to 7. Absolutely brilliant. We do have some extra time after 7 if you guys are willing. But let's move on to our next question. I'll give you just about a minute to respond to this one. I recently shared a Facebook post while I wrote a Facebook post, and I said, isn't it cute when politicians call journalists colleagues? And of course, I was being very sarcastic about that. It follows a press conference that I was watching with the Minister of Labour. And Tembisa and Karima were amongst the first to respond to that post. I want to read their comments so we can unpack them. Tembisa said there are several habits unique to this country's media fraternity. 2 come to mind. First, journalists clap hands like the rest in the crowd when politicians make certain points. Second, journalists often join in a chorus of laughter at any stupid remarks or gestures made by politicians. I can't stand that. Karima Brown, me neither. As if we are damn cheerleaders. It's odd and it's inappropriate. Also, I hate it when we start off with mame this or tate this or that. We're not children, and they're not our aunts and they're not our uncles. It's so annoying. And my response was, days authentic debate at the beginning of lockdown, the police minister called journalists a rogue unit who can't be trusted. And I sat there shocked. All I could hear was nervous laughter coming from the journalists sitting in the house who obviously don't want to be kicked out, right? Meanwhile, the health minister took a very different approach. He made a point of thanking journalists all the time, live on air. Me personally, I'm waiting for a journalist to say we're not colleagues, we're journalists. So let's get your comments on that one. Let's start with Karima.
Well, you've expressed some of my views already, which I shared on your Facebook post. So the first thing is we are not colleagues of government. We have a relationship with government that puts us sometimes at odds with government. And that's how it should be in a democracy. It's a pull-push relationship. We have to have ground rules, and that ground rules have generally been set. We have seen instances where politicians try to break those ground rules, where they try and bully and intimidate journalists. We've recently had an ANC parliamentarian who threatened to shoot somebody who had to apologize. Now, in another country, that parliamentarian would have lost his job because someone who threatens to shoot a journalist isn't fit, in my view, to hold public office and to be in parliament. So the bar here in South Africa is also low. We think everything can be excused by an apology. If someone apologizes, then we think, it's done. It's almost like our tendency when someone dies to gloss over what their lives were like. We don't like reporting on the controversial stuff. And when we do, we run up into ridiculous arguments that says it's not our culture to talk ill of the dead. Our culture as journalists is to speak the truth, even if that truth is uncomfortable. And I made the point once about the fact that I feel sorry for the person who has to write the obituary of Mangosuthu Buthelezi, because there is a desperate attempt to be revisionist about the exact role that he played in the perpetuation of apartheid. If you listen to the IFP and some of the ridiculous comments coming from certain quarters, one would swear that Gacha Buthelezi took up arms against South Africa's apartheid regime and wasn't in fact part of a Bantustan system, which was discredited throughout the world. So there is no equivalence between us and politicians. There is a joint working relationship. We need each other. But here's the other thing. Access journalism has also become a huge problem in South Africa. If the government doesn't like certain people, or if a minister doesn't like certain people, they deliberately withhold public information, which all of us should have access to, and give it only to certain individuals. Now, look, we all build relationships with people, and that's our right. And we secure high-profile interviews and so on. And that's important. But very recently, the president was told that his economic cluster ministers are unavailable for scrutiny. I have an experience with the finance minister, Tito Mboweni. Since I've done the fix, I have asked him to come onto my program. And I'm not saying he has an obligation to come onto my program, but he has an obligation to engage with the South African media in general, not just with financial media or, a financial news agency like Bloomberg or Reuters. And there is also this tendency that the economy is only for certain journalists that are, in the financial sector. And if you look at ordinary people, it's they that have to balance their household budgets. They have to figure out how to raise 8 children where only one person is getting a grant. So this idea of managing the finance minister and managing the treasury so that the markets don't get upset is deeply undemocratic and needs to change, because the economy is something that affects all of us. In fact, it affects the poor most of all.
Absolutely. Let me pass the mic over, Karima, to Nkosikhona now. Nkosikhona, when you hear journalists being referred to as colleagues, how uncomfortable are you? Do you think that journalists are being groomed to become more submissive and friendly when you're called colleagues?
Well, indeed, my experience, Shabnam, has been that I see older journalists, right? Some of them have actually become spin doctors, and those that haven't yet, it's almost as if they're auditioning to become spin doctors, and therefore young journalists like me who don't have, a lot of expenses, if you may, we've actually learned about this industry prior to getting in, that it's not I'm not going to get rich. It's not something where I have to do in order to get rich. And therefore, the lifestyle that I've taken, I actually understand that this is the kind of car that I will drive. And you have people who gaslight you at press conferences, right? So you get older journalists. I'm talking about the kind that I say, in my view, it's almost as if they're auditioning to become spin doctors. They've been frustrated over the years that they feel young people like me, they actually come up to me and say, you know what, you're going to get over this, right? People who demotivate us to do our jobs, but also it actually fuels spin doctors who actually are in government as well as politicians to find people like us as too much. My personal experiences, and I'm saying this because I want to actually share an experience of a fellow journalist as well. I am a young Black African male, right? And so my experience has been culture is being used. You find that, I'm fluent in my home language of isiZulu, right? But because the media house I work for, I need, at the end of the day, soundbites, which are in English, right? You find that people then start switching off to our language, right? On an on-record conversation. And it's almost as if people are trying to silence you into doing something, trying to bribe you using culture, trying to bribe me using my language, and then gaslighting me. But my experience of also young female journalists is even worse, because they're gaslighted, and it's almost as if they are being referred to as just, in a flirtatious language, which makes me uncomfortable observing this, right? Young female journalists, it's almost, people are being complimented on their beauty right in the middle of doing their job as journalists, and I find that frustrating. Let me just end it there, because this is just my experience, but I know we have limited time, so let me just end it there and let's get more to the questions.
Very, very powerful points made there by Nkosikhona. Qaanitah, this revolving door is real, right? Are you thinking journalists are getting groomed by being called colleagues, and how should we respond to this?
I think that there's a element of that is true, that there is a level of over friendliness sometimes that is we should be all uncomfortable towards, and the reality of this job is that it's almost like a mutually beneficial relationship, in that we need to speak to journalists and they need to speak to the media, but then there's this healthy discord that exists right in the middle of that. And so I think that I am not one of those journalists who believe that we need to be antagonistic for the sake of being that the freedom of the media or the freedom of the press, it needs to be manifested in an antagonistic way. I don't think that's necessary at all. I do think there needs to be a healthy difference between the two. There needs to be there needs to be some sort of duality, just something that is a level of respect, but not over friendliness. And I think that unfortunately, we've seen it happen a lot of the time. You see it particularly in political circles. But then we're only focusing on political circles. You can see this level of fraternation. What is the word? The word fraternizing. Thank you, Karima. English evaded me right now. But you see that fraternizing, whether it's in the arts journalism, whether it's in sports journalism. So there is a definite argument that has to be made. It's absolutely bogus. That point about where politicians literally humiliate journalists and the room of journalists laugh in chorus is absolutely ridiculous. And I think that one, it could be just ignorance or lack of experience, because the people that I've looked up to and the people that I've reported journalists worth their salt know that is behavior that is completely off limits. And I think that the more we have these types of conversations, that absolutely not, there is no love lost between us and politicians. Obviously, the line becomes a little bit more, sort of kind of when it comes to like media liaison officers or spokespeople, because their job is to liaise with us. So we could be colleagues in that space. But I do think that this is a very, very important discussion, because we've seen it across the fence. We've seen it from the EFF. We've seen it from ministers and how they treated, for example, new age reporters or NN7 reporters. Now we see it with eNCA. We saw it with the Sunday Times at some point. And so I think a level of healthy distance is very important. And we really do have to consciously warn against over-familiarity.
Well, one thing I'm very certain about is that none of the journalists on this panel will be clapping, cheering, or referring to ministers as Ntate before they ask them any questions. All right, Carmen Goldstone, former journalist and comedian, recently shared a 5-minute video. His critique about the apparent blurring of lines between news reporting, analysis, and opinion, and why this could be unhealthy. I know you've watched it already, but what are your thoughts? Are journalists just fed up, so they want to give their opinion on what's going on? And a follow-on, can and should journalism be totally objective? I can give you a minute each. We're already at 20 to 7. Karima?
I don't think there's objectivity in journalism. I think objectivity for me is a myth. Nobody comes at the news with a blank slate. We all have our worldviews. I think there are certain things that we need to uphold as journalists. And for me, they are accuracy, balance, and fairness. And the most important is context. Those are the 4 things for me that is important. When I'm going to report on a racist, there's no other side. The person who's a racist doesn't have the same rights as the person who's fighting racism. My dad liked saying, if one person says it's wet outside and another person says it's dry, you don't say on the one hand it's wet and on the other hand it's dry. You stick your hand out and you see if it's bloody raining. And that's our job. Our job is to go and find the truth. And that's why I'm also not comfortable with Fakuda speaking about alternative facts. If it's alternative, it's not facts. Facts are facts. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. That's the world that Donald Trump lives in. And that's a dangerous world, because that questions epistemology, which is essentially a fancy word for how one arrives at the truth. And I think that is important. And in South Africa, we've seen efforts by political projects, particularly the state capture project, where people input into the narrative false information and false and disinformation. So it's not even fake news, it's just false. And most importantly, it's not alternative facts. They are without any factual basis. And I think we need to make those distinctions, because what politicians also like doing is, if they don't like what you say, they just say that's fake news. But that is not what fake news is. So we need to make distinctions between disinformation, misinformation, information that has no factual basis. And we can't be speaking about alternative facts, because there aren't alternative facts. It's either wet or it's not. You can't say, if you say it's not wet when it's raining, then you have an alternative fact. That's nonsense. And I think it's really important to understand that, which is why we need to be accurate, we need to be fair, we need to have balance, and we need to have context.
All right, Nkosikhona, if you've watched those videos from Calvin H. Goldstone, he's talking about a style of journalism where the journalist will report on the facts, do a news report, and then offer an opinion on that report or what's happening in the country. And it seems to be a trend that's developing in South African media. The public seems to love it. Some journalists seem to take issue with it and say, just report the news. You're not there to offer your opinion if you're not doing an opinion analysis-based show. What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are that journalists should be known of what they stand for. I think the sooner we get to that point, the better. But when you are reporting news, for me, I really do think that a news report, especially in the online space, which is now dominant, just stick to that. But there are opportunities for you on that very same platform for you to then raise your point. I think there has to be a distinction when you make an opinion. I mean, just to touch on what Karima said about the issue of fairness, it is very, very important now more than ever for us to normalize a culture where we understand that objectivity in the sense of people thinking about it does not exist. We all have our politics, our way we view things, and we do have to have the space where we are known of what we stand for. I think the sooner we normalize that, the better for audiences even to make their choice. I mean, they know that when this particular journalist reports on this particular story, they come from this particular school of thoughts. But I just want to make a point to say, to highlight on this particular platform for us to reflect on. You know, with the recent clicks racist adverts that emerged over the past in recent weeks, we have had reports saying that various click stores have been vandalized, and this comes after EFF leader Julius Malema said attack, right? And that's the news, right? And then we were given facts about it. My problem with that kind of reports that I've seen is that I seem not to find the statement where it says Malema and EFF leaders who speak on this particular issues have been explicit, right? They've called for peaceful protest, right? And for me, as much as you may, because many journalists, especially those who reflect on politics, have their own personal experiences with Julius Malema in his way. And I do think that media houses and media platforms, and in basically all platforms that we have, do allow us to air our own views on our personal interactions with Malema. But the reports must be specific, just regardless of the experiences you have had with Malema, to say that he did at onset call for peaceful protests. My biggest issue right now is that it seems as if the opinion is not distinct, right? Whereas we do have an opportunity to be distinct about our opinion, and also presenting other political parties as more violent and others as not being violent. Because I can tell you now, the manner in which some EFF members behave, you will see it at ANC conferences, you'll see it at even DA conferences, right? And I think that's something that we have to really talk about.
An important point there, Nkosikhona. Qaanitah, the style of opinion, then the report, or the report, then the opinion. You know, my thought was it's because journalists are fed up, right? But Calvin's opinion is we're emulating American-style journalism because that's what takes the numbers up. What do you think?
No, I think that, you know, we live in a fantasy world where you can just, as a journalist, just put forward a set of raw facts without any level of interpretation of what this actually means in context. So there's a difference between context and a difference between opinion. I think as a journalist, we have to make sense of what we are seeing, so and providing it as thought leaders to people who read and consume our work. And the reality of it is that if we keep insisting that the sky is red and the sky is red, without the context that there is a wildfire for the last week, what good are you doing to your readers? And so I think at the end of the day, we must not lose trust. We must not lose focus that what we do is in the public interest. And so for me, there is absolutely nothing wrong in journalists expressing opinions. And the reality of it is that if you understand the fundamentals of journalism, you know that you have to be accurate, you have to be fair, you have to be truthful. That is the premise on which you show up into covering a story. And so if your analysis is that the DA is making a fundamentally wrong decision when it removes race as a criteria for transformation, that is completely within your rights because it adds to the dialogue. Not to say I could never have an interview with Gwen Ngwenya again because she has a different view to what I stand. The same with other political parties. And I think that, it probably spurred debate when it started happening on broadcast, because you never really see it happening on broadcast news before, where presenters would express their opinions. But you're living in this bubble to believe that the person who's reading the news to you doesn't have certain views on certain matters and is being adding to the dialogue. I mean, radio presenters have done it for the longest time. Editors write columns weekly. Journalists write columns weekly. And I think that as long as there is this media literacy, where there is a strict demarcation between the two, where this is opinion and analysis, or this is the news. And I think then that type of media literacy enhances public debate and enriches conversation. Now if I take the argument about Julius Malema, for example, and saying there's protests happening around the clicks, or stores have been vandalized. You cannot ignore the fact, and that's a different scenario. That's not opinion. That is context, and it's your job as a journalist to find the context and to bring together what's relevant around a particular issue that you're exploring. That you may disagree with this person, but the reality of it is that there is this tweet. He did say attack. It's as manifest as it comes. Yes, there's and there's a subsequent tweet that says peaceful protest. We reflect that as well. And so for me, Shabnam, my takeaway is distinguish between the two. There is no such thing as the people who perpetuate this sort of pie in the sky objectivity in a way to say you're not objective as a journalist. That what does that actually mean, in the sense that are you being unfair? Are you violating the press code? Or you disagree that I have an opinion on something and that I must live in a world where I have no opinion around very important.
My takeaway, Qaanitah, from what you just said, that point about media literacy is so important. We've got about 2 minutes left before Nkosikhona needs to go, and then I'm going to collapse the last 3 questions into one. So let's tackle this one first, Nkosikhona. Let's talk about the Clicks Unilever debacle. Again, it exposed fractures between journalism and politics, fractures which have serious implications for civil society's access to information. Now, in the last year alone, Azara Karim, News 24, Aviwe from eNCA, Nobisu to eNCA, gender, race, different media platforms have all been harassed, intimidated, or attacked. It also revealed this Clicks debacle, that is, what people see as misogyny, the silencing of the natural hair community as well as journalists. And I want to get to Karima because you got called an angry woman. I don't know how you being a woman is relevant to the conversation, but let's start with you, Nkosikhona, before you have to go. Where do we go from here, considering what this Clicks Unilever debacle has now revealed to us about the relationship between politicians and journalists?
Well, I think the first and foremost thing is that by the way, I will stay on. I've just managed to get myself out of the engagement. This is super fruitful, and I would like to stay on up until 7:30. Look, one of the things that I was told when I entered journalism was that it's not an easy industry to be in, right? And all these challenges that we're facing, I do think is challenges that we have to expect, but it's a war that we have to fight on. I think our times are demanding that you become a journalist because you are passionate about it and you understand its role in society. And These incidents are unfortunate, but they are an impetus for us to keep on the good fights, because if we give up on its rights, I am totally, and I obviously cannot speak about this woman because I mean, I really don't want to sound out of touch or not being sympathetic or understanding enough, right? But I do think from where they are, they cannot then be cancelled as journalists, right? I do think that they need to be supported, that there needs to be more women in the industry, and that their fight is a fight that is worth keeping on. Journalism is not easy. I'm appreciative of the fact that there's so many wars that have been fought for us to be here. I think 2 days ago we had a Zandile Gumede case. Can you believe at the last court appearance, the media was barred from reporting on a very important, no one was allowed inside courts, right? But it's a war that we had to fight. There were 2 journalists we actually had to be part of that. It was myself and Nabila Sheikh from ETV News. We had to go and sit in a meeting with the president of the regional president of the courts, and we had to spend about an hour with her explaining why media had to be allowed in there. It was an extremely uncomfortable discussion because we had this white woman constantly referring to us as, you people should know about this, telling us about all these rules and laws. They change so frequently, we can't keep up to them, about accessing courts and reporting from that, right? But it is something that I can't just be I have to cry. I have to be uncomfortable about it. Perhaps I should cry. But the thing is, I don't think that it is time for us to break down in front of people, right? And I'm not willing to do that. I'm not trying to say people are not supposed to feel whatever, but this is something that we have to wage on. And I think everyone else who enters journalism, I say this as a young journalist because I've experienced problems, and I say, without being unsympathetic to the problems that people are facing, understand that you have a bigger role to play in society, and it's not easy.
Some inspiring words there from a young journalist. Karima, the Clicks Unilever debacle has shown us some things, exposed the fractures, it has implications. But throughout this year, we've seen News 24 as well as eNCA, and we could rattle up a whole list of journalists who've been disrespected, harassed, intimidated, or attacked. Doesn't matter the gender, the race, the different media platforms, and we've seen this misogyny. Where do we go from here? I mean, just this morning, you were called an angry woman in an interview where you were trying to elicit the truth. So what is your opinion on this? Where do we go from here? How do we move forward?
I think we must call out politicians who refuse to be accountable. That's the first thing. When we ask politicians a question or spokespeople, they are not doing us a favor by answering. That is their job. They take on the responsibility to be public officials, and so they have to answer questions. So if I speak to the spokesperson of the Defense Ministry and I ask him, did the African National Congress request from this SANDF that they get a lift to their meeting with ZANU-PF via the SANDF jet, then I don't want to be told I'm angry. You know, I want the person to answer the question. When I speak to the Justice Minister, because I'm going to speak to him about the rule of law and the fact that we are now investigating whether a sitting judge president in the Western Cape ordered a hit, as was allegedly, said by or rather a prisoner said that this has happened and this is now being investigated. I can't see the Justice Minister saying to me when I do my job, don't try and ambush me because I didn't come here for that. I've had instances where the Minister of Sport and Culture, who used to be the police minister, when I asked him to come on to speak about whether or not he was in a meeting with prosecutors just before they arrested the former head of the Hawks in KwaZulu-Natal, Johan Boysen, he said, he had every right to be in that meeting. And at first he said he wasn't. When I read the minutes to him and that he was signed in there, he was embarrassed. That information is now part of the testimony at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, which Johan Boysen has entered into. So we've often had situations where you are told that you have a personal grudge against the minister. And the political parties also have supporters who does that. So I'm often told I'm jealous of Julius Malema, or that I hate.
Can I ask you? I've got a question from Nanda Subin. I'm going to ask you just now. Karima, can I ask you to pause on that thought for me?
Yeah.
And the reason being that Qaanitah needs to leave in 1 minute. Qaanitah, any response to that question? I'm going to pass the mic back to Karima after you.
Karima, you are jealous of Julius Malema. I hate him, so. But I mean, where to from here? I think journalists need to continue doing what we're doing. I think that the more we, the South African proverb, touch them on their studio, the more they're going to push back. And I think that if these attacks, I mean, we had it, full force during the Bell Pottinger era, and what happened is that we continued staying on course and we exposed what was behind that. And so I think that was the most important lesson for us to learn from the Bell Pottinger scenario and how they attacked us so terribly, is that the attacks warrants you to continue doing what you're doing. And if I have any advice for my colleagues, and this, when I mean colleagues, I mean my colleagues, not politicians, but is that attacks show us that we're doing something right. Stay on it. And that's what I say constantly to people who've come after me in this when I use the word younger journalists very loosely because I'm very young, but that's the point that I'm making, in that we have to stay our course. We have to continue doing what we're doing, because at the end of the day, it is whatever we do, we're doing it for the public good and in the public interest. Thank you so much.
All right, let me ask you this quick question, yes or no, before you go. Nanda Subin, have any of you ever been offered a brown envelope? Yes or no? Qaanitah?
Absolutely not, and I really wonder why I was never offered one.
All right, we'll let you go. We'll let you go before I ask that question of Karima and Nkosikhona. Thank you very much, Qaanitah Hunter, political editor, News 24, for joining us on The People's Voice and for being a voice for the people.
Thank you very much. Shukran.
All right, Nkosikhona, any brown envelopes came your way?
No, but I must say that I have been offered, trips that I've been worth discussing with my editor, and I'll end it there.
All right, Karima, any envelopes came your way before you continue with your previous response? Never.
No.
They wouldn't take a chance.
No. I think, people often, especially male politicians, they like to mansplain me. So I'm often told that I'm a fighter, that I like arguing, that I get angry, that I'm, I get excited. That's the other adjective that is often used. And I never hear my male colleagues describe
emotional
in the same way. Yes. So in as much as they all stand there with their obligatory GBV, anti-GBV posters and women empowerment, they constantly actually come at me because I'm female and attach to me a certain set of labels that people use in essentially trying to silence women and trying to tell women that they're emotional and so on. And the level of education and literacy in relation to the struggle against patriarchy is so poor in South Africa, particularly among our politicians, that a whole deputy leader of a party can choke a journalist on the precinct of parliament and still be there. And you still have, that person can also call a journalist a white bitch. And then other women politicians in that party will say they are against women abuse. And we are expected to take all these people seriously. So for me, the basic thing here is that I am not going to be mansplained by any politician, and I'm not going to be told that I don't have the right to ask questions. If you agree to come onto my program, then it means that I can interview about the stuff that happens or any other matter. This idea that you can only speak about a specific subject, and the ANC loves this. When they have press conferences, particularly at the Thule House, many of the people who are in the party are also in government, and that's perhaps the only opportunity that you get to put a question to them. And it's the same with the ANC president. who often never speaks as an ANC president, always speaks as a state president. So it's difficult to ask him party questions. So when you use that opportunity, you often get manhandled by the spokespeople and by the gatekeepers. And the funny thing is, most politicians can hold their own. I mean, they are politicos, you know, they are used to arguing, they are used to engaging, it's robust. And I'm not sure always that the spokespeople understand that it's not their job to hide the principle from the truth. They have to obviously take care of the principle, but the context must be accountability. It must be transparency. We're not in a banana republic.
This gatekeeping is a serious issue.
Yeah, because my understanding was 7 o'clock. So my
yes.
apologies.
I'll continue with Nkosikhona. Thank you for joining us, Karima Brown, the presenter of The Fix, for joining us on The People's Voice and for being a voice of the people.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you, Karima.
Nkosikhona, it's you and I. Thank you for making this extra time. What happened to Nobesuthu? You know, politicians are saying, look, it wasn't an incident of gender-based violence. It was just a touch. It wasn't anything that was violent or an assault in any way. Do you agree? I mean, if we take that kind of attitude, what will happen to journalists interacting with politicians?
Look, I think that incident is inexcusable. It should not have happened, and it is indefensible. And I do think that, I mean, there's so many challenges that women journalists like Nobesuthu face all the time. I mean, we see it daily, where you feel as if you have a responsibility to protect your fellow journalists, even if they come from a different media house. You go to a female journalist to report about the Point Road, the Mahatma Gandhi Road in Durban, and they have to go up, you know, to the last floor of a tall building. I mean, that is not safe, right? But I do think I'm happy that that incident has now brought us to this discussion, because journalism, unfortunately, is not normalized in South Africa. I mean, there's so many police officers who still trouble us, who give us problems when we try and do our work. You know, it's so difficult still to fight for access to venues to do our work properly. And I mean, just like Karima said, the gatekeepers are people that I think needs to be conscientized about the work of journalism.
I think they know. I think their job is to be the gatekeepers. I think they're told that they need to behave in that particular way. It is their instruction. But let's move on from there, Nkosikhona. Given everything we ventilated thus far on the show, what is the relationship between journalists and politicians? Friends, enemies, or eagle-eyed watchers?
Look, I want to go back to the point that was made earlier by Qaanitah, and that I don't subscribe to the idea that we can be enemies with politicians. I do think that that relationship needs to be cordial, but in any sense, politicians need to understand that we're there to do our work, because I was fortunate now to get an understanding what this program will be about. I was thinking about this. Many of us, when we are raised, when we grow up, we taught the basic principles of respect, right? And so I don't think that has to change when you are a journalist, because I think it reflects in many years once you stay in. When you are respectful in how you pose a question to a politician, when you are respectful in terms of how you accept their response, and when you try to conduct yourself in a respectful manner, not in a way that you are sucking up, if I may, but you are just showing the true values that you hold dear. And that's part of respect, is that you respect yourself enough not to take any disrespect from anyone else. And so if you are able to hold a certain decorum in terms of how the discussion is held, I think that is what we have to try and fight to get. And those are the kind of values that I think we have to uphold. We don't have to be disrespectful. We don't have to be outright ignorant. I think we have to maintain respect, and we have to demand that from politicians.
Absolutely agree with you. Nkosikhona, what do you then think? What do you believe civil society expects, demands, and deserves in terms of the relationship between journalism and politics? The context being, we face massive challenges in our country, right? We know about the influence of capital on media and politics, and we know that the media is shrinking as a result of the lockdown. So what do you think civil society expects of this relationship between journalists and politicians?
Look, I think civil society expects collaboration with journalists, right? And I do think that they expect to work with journalists. They expect journalists to be upright in terms of how they do their jobs, because once someone calls themselves a civil society, or once someone takes up the role of being an activist, it means that they're putting themselves up for great risk, perhaps career limitations. I mean, when you speak about when you seem anti-capitalist or anti the way in which the society is structured right now, you limit yourself, right, in terms of how you progress. And I think what civil society activists deserve of journalists is truthfulness. Journalists who understand the importance of their overall societal gain. We are all out here to fashion a higher civilization, right? It cannot be that we're pursuing individual wealth at the expense of society, because it should make sense to everyone else that it really would not serve you any good if you are the richest person in a village of poor people, because in any case you're going to have to invest in security, which is not a nice thing, right? And that's and
That's
I
interesting
and I
perspective.
yeah. So
Absolutely interesting.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to our last question, Nkosikhona. In an era of journalist whistleblowers or whistleblower journalists like Julian Assange, who is facing massive persecution, of course, for his role in exposing the truth in terms of global politics, who has the most power? Journalists, politicians, civil society, or big capital? When I speak about big capital, I'm talking about them in relation to journalism, because they do the advertising, right? They pay for the advertising that pays the salaries. But I'm also talking about big capital in relation to political parties, because they're the funders for these massively expensive campaigns. So who has the most power? Journalists, politicians, big capital, or civil society?
I think who has the biggest power is obviously big capital, and the case in point is the Julian Assange matter. He shouldn't be up in captivity after doing such brilliant work for journalism. His work is revolutionary, and that's the kind of journalism that we need. But in the world we're living in right now, I mean, I did touch on the fact that we see senior journalists who previously done amazing work, and it's now seeming as if they're auditioning to become spin doctors for government, because it is basically, it makes financial sense for them to do so. When you have media companies that are retrenching people, it is the most unfortunate thing when you have to deal with someone who's given their all to journalism, right? People have spent 20 years and they're told that, listen, you're out because there's no more money to pay you. And they're told that 2 weeks from now, because a virus has come in. It is a devastating situation. But it needs to change, right? I think it's quite clear that capital still runs the way journalism works, and hence I made the earlier point about the revenue generation ideas, right? I do think that journalists need to spend time. Anyone who cares about journalism and media work that is ethical, that is fair, because the only way we can keep up ethical, fairness, and accuracy is if we have space to do so. When you have to churn out 3 stories per day, you don't have enough time to actually verify all the information that comes to you, right? And you kind of have to give out those stories because it makes financial sense for the business to keep going. So if we have enough time and resources to actually invest in journalism that gives out the results that we need, then we need to work at, changing or transforming the situation. And hence I say, maybe we need to start thinking about bright ideas of changing the situation. Why is Google and Facebook taking so much of our money? And how can we stop them?
Interesting. Very, very interesting insight there.
I mean, they're
Nabila
making
Sheikh
money
is
out of the show right now. Shabnam, they're making money out of the show right now.
That's true. Nabila Sheikh has just joined the show among some other people joining on the live video and the watch party. That's it for the list of questions that I had for our panel. But I want to ask you one last one, because I'm really, really interested in you as a journalist, Nkosikhona, and the influence you are going to have on journalists coming after you. What is your advice to aspiring journalists or to young journalists that are finding their feet in the space of journalism and politics and thinking, what did I get myself into? What is your advice to them?
Well, my advice to them is that they should understand that they have a generational mission to fulfill. That is first and foremost. Your work as a journalist cannot be divorced from the overall aim of our society. You're not there to just earn a salary and perhaps take yourself out of poverty, if you may, or just make sure that you have an income to live and maybe help your immediate family. The journalism that we do today will live on forever. Everything that is put online will stay on there. These will be case studies for generations, for people who are not born yet, and they will be learning from the work that we have been doing. And I think that anyone who enters journalism must understand that they need to be patient with themselves, because they actually have a generational mission to follow, that we are working in a journalism field that is heavily challenged, and we are perhaps the generation that have to lay down the foundation of what journalism means in this kind of industry. As we are saying, as I want to maintain this point of saying that the revenue generation, the way in which journalism is funded today is currently in tatters. So there needs to be brighter ideas about how we maintain that and what to do. And so everything that we do today has to be about that. And when you understand that you have a generational mission, then your immediate selfish interest must, to the best of your ability, subside. And I'm not saying people must subscribe to poverty, because that will not do you any good, but you must understand that you have chosen this, and keep at the back of the mind what journalism can do for this generation and the future generations.
Progressive thinking, values in journalism, and an important point about the generational mission. In some ways, I think that the new journalists are really blessed in a sense, because they don't have this expected loyalty to the liberation movement, in that sense, where all the journalists have that sort of loyalty within them, and this inner conflict as to whether I can really take on this party because I have this political loyalty. And our younger journalists perhaps don't have to deal with as much of that conflict of interest. I think they're in a better position. You want to just give us your closing thoughts on that?
Yes, and I totally agree. I think what we have seen in recent years is a new breed of activists coming up. I think the Fees Must Fall generation, which I am a part of, has shown us that we have different wars as we're fighting off, Shabnam. And I mean, you look at the issues of ecology, right? We have to move beyond the whole issues of black whites. I mean, I've had an opportunity to just not just go overseas, but to actually live in a country where they don't have the same problems as ours. They're not in a much more racialized society as ours. Their issues, I mean, I'm talking about South America, Brazil here, their issues were more about class. But I then had an opportunity, because I was on an educational program where I was dealing with people from other countries, and you do realize that the global issues that we're facing right now, the way in which capital is structured, the way in which people get jobs, we are not going to have the work is not going to be done the way we're doing right now. What does this universal income grant mean for people? These are all ideas that we need to really think about. Our world is transforming very fast. What does it mean for people who will not be able to work simply because there isn't much that they'll be able to do? What do we imagine about our future? And I think these are all the questions that we need to find answers to. And I think journalism can play a great part in that, because we have access to a lot of influential people. They can be able to give guidance, and we can be able to then fashion these discussions. You see, this particular discussion that we're having right now will live beyond our times, Shatnam, right? It will be a conversation that people can reflect on. And whatever it is that we're talking about, it should be that then. Because they'll be spitting on our graves if we don't do enough.
Absolutely agree with you. A sentence in the history of our country, this conversation about the relationship between journalists and politicians, journalism and politics. What is it? Friends, enemies, artful and watchful, eagle-eyed watchers? What does civil society expect? It's been a brilliant, insightful, robust conversation with our panel this evening, including Nkosikhona Duma, KZN, a correspondent, as well as Qaanitah Hunter, with who is the political editor for News 24, Nkosikhona, of course, with EyeWitness News, and Karima Brown, who is an analyst and a journalist, host of the Fix eNCA. I want to say thank you to all of our guests. Thank you, Nkosikhona, for being with us on The People's Voice and for being a voice of the people. Thank you very much. All right, as Sadiq exits Nkosikhona from the studio, well, it's been another brilliant episode of The People's Voice this evening, and the message certainly resonates again in the voice of Steve Biko. The most powerful weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, and journalism has a role to make sure that does not happen. Thank you to all of our brilliant guests today, Nkosikhona Duma, Qaanitah Hunter, and Karima Brown, our listeners and our viewers, as always, who seem to have really enjoyed the conversation, as well as the Salaamedia team, including Sadiq on technical production. And let's remember to ask ourselves every day, what are we doing to make a difference in our communities, our countries, and our world? Until next week, revolutionary peace. Assalamu alaikum.